Hello everyone, my name is John Dunbar and this is my video for the case study we're doing for missing Booster Club funds. First of all, over a summary of the case. This is a case involved the George Washington Middle School, has about 450 students. And it's in a large city and it's a residential area, low socioeconomic area. Principal's Mr. Stevens. There's no assistant principal, no athletic director. He has to do it all. So they use volunteers. They work with the Booster Club, and they have two adults that help do tickets at ball games, and they have a couple tickets to concessions. And Mr. Bowman has policies in place, guidelines they're supposed to follow. So one of the volunteers is Mrs. Bowman. Mrs. Bowman done this for several years. She has three kids. Two of her boys, they've already gone on to high school. She has a daughter in seventh grade, and this daughter is real good at cheerleading and went to a camp and she won all-state cheerleader and won this opportunity to go to New York City to participate in a parade there. So this problem involves this part of the problem is that Mrs. Bowman went to Mr. Stevens and asked if the PTA could help fund this trip. It's going to be $728, and she had all the expenses lined out so that he could see. But he tells her that she shouldn't be able to use the PTA funds. The PTA funds are meant to be used for all students, or at least most of them. So he nixes that idea. So the next time he sees her at the last basketball game of the season, and Mrs. Bowman is one of the volunteers taking money. And they end up, at the end of the night, she hands him the bag. She was taking tickets, and there were 10 tickets missing, and she had put a note in the bag saying that the tickets were torn. So she didn't. I guess she didn't sell the tickets. We really don't know from the story. But Mr. Stevens obviously suspects that because he'd also talked to Mr. Dumas at the ball game. I just happened to see him come in and saw a wad of cash he was putting away. And Mr. Dumas, he talked to him. Mr. Dumas said that he had just gotten paid, and he had to give a $50 bill to get in. So he's looking for that $50 bill then at the end of the night. And Mr. Stevens doesn't see it in the bag. All he saw was that note, 10 tickets, and the tickets are $5 a piece. So the way the story is presented, he obviously assumes that Mrs. Bowman's taking the money. Now, as far as identifying the problem, so I've listed here the things we know, things we don't know. First of all, things we know, there's 10 tickets missing, and there's no money for those 10 tickets. Now, we also know about the story Mrs. Bowman requested to help with her daughter's trip, and Mr. Stevens rejected that idea. And we also know that Mr. Dumas told the principal that he paid with a $50 bill when he entered, but that $50 bill is not in the bag. So now, things we don't know. Was the money really stolen? First of all, we don't really know that. What did Mrs. Bowman do with the missing tickets? Just because they were torn, they still should have been in the bag. What does the other volunteer? There's two taking tickets. There's two doing the concessions. The other volunteer should have been involved in counting the money at the end of the night. So, what does she know about the missing tickets? And then finally, was that $50 bill used for change? Was there a $100 bill in the bag? So there's just some of the things I'd like to know. Okay, next for my proposed plan of action, then, because there's a lot we don't know. My first thought here is that we should talk to that other person that volunteered, see if she knows about the missing tickets. And then I would schedule a meeting with Mrs. Bowman. ask her about the tickets. We have every right to ask about those, and we could use this as a teaching moment. Explain that all tickets have to be accounted for. So even if the tickets are torn or there's something wrong with them, they still need to be in the bag, or we need to have the money for them for being sold. So depending on how all these conversations go, if you don't have any hint that everybody swears nothing wrong, you really can't assume anything here. So depending on how these conversations go, I might ask about the $50 bill, but you can't assume that money was stolen. And I sure wouldn't ask, even though it crossed my mind, I sure wouldn't ask Mr. Dumas about that $50 bill, because he'll immediately assume something's wrong, and we'll be wanting to know. He might spread rumors around. So at this point, that's I just would try to find out from Mrs. Bowman what she could tell you. And again, depending on how she answers the questions, would decide a lot about what to do next. Okay, so now we talk about resolving the issue, so the PTA funds are for projects supporting all students. Okay, and don't want to assume the worst by jumping to conclusions. And you want to ask questions, do your investigation, but I want to stress you want to trust people. You can't just assume that something happened unless you can prove it. You don't want to be accusing anybody of doing anything wrong. My opinion, the principal jumped to conclusions here and from the very start. And I also didn't really like how he answered Mrs. Bowman's question about helping her daughter. I thought he should have deferred it to the PTA. He doesn't run the PTA. He's just an advisor. And I thought he was thinking of all students, and that's good. But I think he could have handled that situation a lot better. Now, debriefing the problem, things I was thinking about, as I was talking about earlier, that Mr. Stevens I thought was too authoritative. And he just acted like he was in charge of the PTA funds. And there's a board and there's other people that make the decisions. So, even though he was correct, I thought he should have suggested to go ahead. She could present it, just that he, explained to Mrs. Bowman how the funds are meant to be for all students. And another thing I thought about was that Mr. Stevens, it was brought out in the story, he didn't have time to monitor the money taking. He was busy supervising the games. He's the only administrator there. So he has to be careful about jumping to any conclusions. After all, he wasn't monitoring things very closely. Anyway, continuing on this debriefing, here's some questions that I have that need answered. As I said earlier, was a $50 bill even, was it used for change? How do we know? From the story, it doesn't tell us what was in the bag exactly. So, also, did the other person know anything about the torn tickets? Maybe she saw the tickets. Maybe she knows what happened to them. Maybe she can vouch for Mrs. Bowman. And then I thought, why would Mrs. Bowman do this? It's only $50. She was needing $728, and she's volunteered for years, helped out for years, been a good volunteer. I just don't think we can assume that she would do that, and especially if we don't have any proof. Okay, next we were to reflect on how we solved the case and reflect for how we thought we did efficient and effective management. And my thoughts are that the first thing, you want to assume the best in people. If these people are volunteer to help you at the ball game, you got to have some trust there. And another thing is you want to do a thorough investigation, but you want to be fair about it. Okay, and use this as a teaching moment. Maybe Mr. Bowman or Mrs. Bowman didn't realize that you have to account for every ticket. And then last thing here, it says how to improve that monitoring in the future. What else could we do? Is there someone else we could assign, or make the people volunteer to count the money in front of you? Might be another thing we could do. So next, we are to reflect for how we thought of social learning for every student. So uh, the way I'm presenting my solutions, I feel like I'm modeling fairness, everybody involved, modeling trustworthiness, okay, and understanding what uh, the problem is and how people feel, and then lastly, promoting projects to benefit all students, not just one. Okay, and then lastly, we would reflect on how our way of solving this problem affects the academic learning of every student. So first of all, of course, we have extracurricular activities. We promote that for all students involved because that's a good thing. The studies have shown that students that are involved with the extracurricular activities do better in school. And we promote volunteerism. I think the students see their parents helping out. I think that's a good example. Maybe they'll do that themselves when they're adults. So that's part of their learning. Um, and you know, I didn't feel Mr. Stevens was being real compassionate, but that's how I think we need to be. Understand what Mrs. Bowman wanted and don't just shut her down. Show some compassion. And then, again, show that you're fair, and trust people, and don't jump to any conclusions. So I guess that's the main point I want to make. Unless we have some proof here, we can't accuse Mrs. Bowman. I wouldn't, there's really, unless there's some hint, unless she shows uh, hesitation or like she's making up stories about where the money went or where the tickets went, I don't think we can do much more than what I've shown. So thank you all for listening.